In US presidential election, the country comes out and doesn't vote for the president. Last year, I made a video about how Australian federal elections are run. I think democracy is really important, and Australia is very different to the US in that we are a constitutional monarchy. We don't get to choose the head of state. That's the monarch of the Commonwealth, currently King Charles III. But we do get to select the people who actually run the country, our governments. And we do that in our federal elections. Some folks thought I did a pretty good job, and a handful of people reacted to it. I was thrilled to see American reacts to how voting in Australia works. I was expecting to see some fabulous new discourse about how the American system works differently, or even a critique of my video, but none of those things were present as the gentlemen sat themselves in the bottom of my full screen, full length video, nodding, grunting, and promoting their social media accounts. I felt quite disappointed, not just because they freebooted my video, but because nothing new was added and opportunities were sorely missed. So today, I'm going to do what those reaction channels didn't do and explain how the US presidential elections work and why they are awful. Just briefly, I'm going to talk about the United States of America's various governments. Similar to Australia, there are 3 levels of government. There's federal, state, and local. Each level is broken into 3 branches of government. There's legislative, who are responsible for writing laws. There's executive, who ensure the laws are carried out, and there's judicial, who evaluate laws. At a federal level, the legislative branch is Congress. They draft proposed laws, confirm presidential appointments, and can declare war. Congress is bicameral, meaning that there are 2 houses. There's the lower house, or the House of Representatives, which is made up of 435 representatives from across the nation. And the upper house, the Senate, made up of 100 representatives from across the nation. These people are elected during federal elections. The House of Representatives has a term of just 2 years, so every 2 years they are voted on. And the Senate has 6-year terms, and they are staggered so that every 2 years about a third of the Senate gets elected. Then there's the executive branch. This includes the president, vice president, and the cabinet, who the president and vice president appoint. They are responsible for much of the running of the country and for the enforcement of the law. The judicial branch is appointed by the president and confirmed by Congress to evaluate laws. I'm just going to be looking at the executive branch, the presidential elections, the ones who decide who the head of the country is. So, how do presidential elections work? Well, there's a bit of a process. It all starts about a year prior to the election itself. Lots of people want to be president, and parties need to decide who they're going to put on the ballot for people to decide on. So in each state, and that's different from state to state, and we won't get too granular, but each state has a caucus or primary where members of each party in each state will select their chosen candidate. A little while later, delegates from each state will meet at the party's national convention, where they will decide on who their presidential nominee will be. Once a presidential nominee is decided on, the campaigning and rigmarole begins. Eventually, election day arrives, and this is on the Tuesday following the first Monday of November every 4 years. This is when the population of the USA come together and vote. These elections are not centralized. There is no one body organizing, so each state runs their own elections for it. And I don't have time to get into how this works in each of the 50 states, but to summarize, any citizen over the age of 18 may not be denied the right to vote. Voting is not compulsory, and that means that voting numbers are actually pretty low. The 2020 presidential election saw the highest levels of voter turnout ever, with a grand total of citizens in states of voting age showing up to vote being 62%, less than 2/3 of people of voting age voted. And this was the biggest turnout ever. Anyway, when the country votes in a general election, they don't actually vote for the president. This is where things get a little complex, but I'll try and keep it simple. On election day, voters mark against the candidate who they want to be president. Then, when the votes are counted, they don't go towards who they want to be president, they go towards the people who get to decide who gets to be president. These people are called electors and belong to the Electoral College. There are 528 electors across the country. Each state has so many electors. How many electors? Well, To ensure that smaller states get a chance, all states are allocated 3 electors to start. Then, depending on how big the population of that state is, more electors will be added, which means that bigger states like California or Florida get more votes than smaller states like Alaska or Wyoming. At a glance, this seems fair, but I'll get to the issues of this in a moment. For the most part, if a candidate gets the most votes in a state, the party who the candidate belongs to wins the spot in the Electoral College, even if the election of the state is only won by 1 vote. All of the Electoral College votes will go to that person. Later that year, the Electoral College meets and they vote for who gets to be president. The winner needing a majority of votes from the Electoral College, or at least 270. Because of this, America is an indirect democracy. The people, the nation, don't actually select the president. They vote for the people who will represent them to select the president. Then, in January of the following year, the new president is transferred the power, or the previous president is re-elected and begins their second term. A president can only be president for 2 full terms. Okay, that's how US presidential elections work. But why do they suck? Well, let's start with the general election. With the exception of North Dakota, people everywhere must register to vote. And because voting isn't compulsory and is handled by each individual state, the process for enrolling to vote can be quite different depending on where you live. There's a link in the resources to how to vote in every state, a great YouTube channel that details how to enroll to vote in your state so that you can vote. Some folks who are in power may not want you to vote because you may be more likely to vote against them, depending on who you are or the demographic you belong to. And people will do sneaky things to try and discourage people from voting. Overly strict ID laws, shorter voting times, harder registration processes, and the purging of voter rolls are all legal ways that folks may use to suppress votes. And that's not even to mention that elections are held not on a weekend when more people are available, but on a Tuesday, which limits availability, especially for those people who can't afford or whose jobs won't allow them to take time off to go and vote. This is why, even with the record number of voters, only 62% of the population who could vote in the 2020 elections did. And I'm going to compare this to Australia's compulsory voting, which generally sees over 90% of the population voting. And that means that Australia's elections are much more effective at capturing what a country actually wants compared to the US, in theory at least. Then there's the actual voting. In Australia, we use preferential voting, meaning that you put whoever you want to represent you as your first preference, your next favourite as your second preference, and so on. You get to rank them. Then the votes are counted and redistributed as per the preferences until a majority is found, or over 50% of an electorate. In the US, unless you're in Maine, which is the only state in the US that uses preferential voting, you'll use a plurality vote. The election in the regions is first past the post, meaning that whoever has the most votes wins that region. And this means that if there are more than 2 candidates, that someone can be elected on less than a majority, or less than 50%, which doesn't feel very democratic. With preferential voting or instant runoff, if at first a majority isn't found, the candidate who had the least votes has their votes redistributed according to the second preference. If a majority still isn't found, then the process repeats, meaning that instant runoff elections are much more representative and allow for a more diverse voting and diverse candidates. It's what will make the most people the most happy. If you're in the US and you're in a state other than Maine and you vote for a third party, or not someone from the Republican or Democrat Party, it might be said that you're throwing away your vote because of how small the chance of them getting a majority is, that your vote is just gone. Now, this isn't possible with preferential voting. There are many flaws in all kinds of voting systems, and these kind of systems often evolve into having 2 major parties. But this is to an extreme level in the US, where third party or independent candidates really aren't given a look in at all. Okay, so we've got a couple of problems so far. We've already have states potentially being decided on less than a majority of votes, but it gets worse when we look at the Electoral College, the people who are actually voted for on election day and who actually decide on who becomes the president. The Electoral College is a mess, Because of the 3 automatic electoral college votes before population is considered, it means that if you are in a smaller state, your vote is worth much, much more than someone living in a bigger state. Let's look at the extremes, the biggest and smallest states, to see how their votes differ. If you live in California, the largest state by population, let's see how it compares to if you were to live in the smallest state, Wyoming. California has about 35 million people, and they, therefore, get the largest number of electoral college votes, 55 in total, which means that there are about 677,000 votes per elector in the electoral college. Whereas Wyoming has a much, much smaller population of only about 560,000 people, and they get 3 electoral votes, which means that there are only about 187,000 votes per electoral vote. This means that if you live in California, your vote is worth only 27.7% of someone from Wyoming. This is the extreme of the scale, but there are discrepancies across the country. If you live in a bigger state, your vote is worth less for president than if you live in a smaller state. If you're in one of the darker states, your vote is worth considerably more than one of the ones living in a lighter state. What this means is that it's not unusual for a US presidential election where the leader of the country for 4 years is decided on is voted in with less than a majority of voters. 5 times so far has a president gotten in on less than 50% of the vote. When your opponent gets more votes than you, it doesn't feel fair for you to be awarded victory. In 2016, the most recent time this happened, at the time of recording anyway, Hillary Clinton got 3 million votes more than Donald Trump. But because of the Electoral College and some votes being worth more than others, this meant that Trump was awarded victory. Getting in on less votes than your opponent is not democratic. Because electorates in Australia aren't exactly the same size, this happens to some extent. Electorates may not vary 10% from the state or territory's average, but votes are much more closely weighted compared to that in the US. And it is important to note that Australia doesn't have a president. We don't elect our king. We don't even elect our prime minister. We elect the people who go into government, and then the people who can make government, who have the majority of seats, they get to decide on prime ministers.
I don't know if I made it especially clear, but in Australia, the members of parliament who are able to form a majority, either because their party won the majority of seats in an election, or they have joined with other parties to form government, they select a member of parliament from their party to be the prime minister. The prime minister is an elected member of parliament who has also been chosen by the members of parliament to be their leader.
So Australia also doesn't directly vote for our prime minister, but we do vote for who gets to represent us in government. But back to the US, we haven't even mentioned how in some states there's actually nothing even holding an elector from keeping their promise of who they vote for. Some states do have laws stating that an elector must vote for who they promise to vote for, but other states don't. Unfaithful electors are not unusual throughout history and have straight up voted for the other candidate at the Electoral College, rendering all the votes from the people who voted for them to represent them moot. Thankfully, none of these unfaithful electors have been involved in deciding a very close election, because that is not democratic. This is totally unnecessary, but it's something that can happen because of the Electoral College. And hold on, am I forgetting something? Yes, what about the 4.4 million people who live in US territories, not US states? Well, these people are US citizens with the same rights as people who live in US states, but they don't get a presidential vote. US citizens living on US soil in US territories, some of which are larger in population than many of the smaller US states, don't get to be represented in presidential elections. That's not democratic. It's true that Australian territories don't get as many representatives on the Senate or the upper house, but they do still get represented compared to the 4.4 million US citizens who don't get a say at all. America prides itself on freedom and democracy, but if we actually examine the US's election system, at least for presidential elections, we find that it falls short. There are too many problems. It's a system that may have made sense when the Union was first founded, back before electronic communication, and electors had to travel by horse to tell the Electoral College who the states voted for. But This is the 21st century, and the US system of presidential elections just sucks. This channel is called That's Pretty Cool, where I like to look at things that make you go, huh, that's pretty cool. And I think democracy is pretty cool. But when democracy is subverted by the systems that are meant to ensure that it works, it's just no good. So what can we do? Well, I'm educating. I'm in Australia, I don't really have a horse in this race, but if you are an American, what can you do? First is to vote. I know we've explained how, depending on which state you're in, your vote is worth less than others, but at the end of the day, your voice can only be heard if you go and vote and be part of democracy at all levels, because a lot of important decisions are not being made by the president, but by Congress or governors or state legislature or city councils or mayors. Don't be a part of the significant portion of folk who don't vote. Again, I encourage you to check out how to vote in every state with information on how to register and vote, because it's a decentralized system that each state runs differently and it can be difficult to navigate. And if you're unhappy, get involved in campaigning for the changing of how democracy is run. If nobody challenges the system or says that they're unhappy, it won't change. An effective democracy is representative and treats all people equally and fairly. And at the moment, the very system for elections in the US does not do that adequately. And just to be clear, I'm in no way suggesting that you should storm buildings, because that's also not democratic, but do let your voice be heard. That's where we're going to leave it for today. I don't generally make videos about things that I don't like, but I do really think that democracy is important, and I find it interesting looking at how democracies around the world work. So if you enjoyed this video, please let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. And I know that there are things that I missed out in this video for the sake of brevity. If there's something that you think is really important, please feel free to mention it in the comments below. And if you'd like to do some further reading about any of the things that I've spoken about in this video, I've left a link to the resources that I used in the description as well. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see some videos where I'm not so sad about the state of things, please feel free to subscribe to That's Pretty Cool, where I do sometimes look into how elections work, but more often I'm looking into things that I find interesting, fill me with a sense of curiosity and wonder, from space, different kinds of science, animals, history, flamingos. I cover all kinds of things, and I think the world is a beautiful place and it's worth exploring and being curious about. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting and you have something that you'd like to do, or even just something that you learned from this video. So thank you for joining me. Take care, stay curious, and we'll see you next time.